And that was the Philippine president, his keynote address at the Shangri-La Dialogue, who is laying out Manila's position on the large issue of the world order that it would prefer to inhabit, and specifically and repeatedly mention of a rules-based international order, his commitment to peace and the rule of law prevailing international norms. For South China Sea, or for the Philippines, they call it the West Philippine Sea, which is the part of the South China Sea that it considers its territory, including its exclusive economic zone. And the adherence to this and the danger of failing to adhere to this. Let's take a listen.
Through our clear moral ascendancy, we find the strength to do whatever it takes to protect our sovereign home, to the last square inch, to the last square millimeter. The life-giving waters of the West Philippine Sea flow in the blood of every Filipino. We cannot allow anyone to detach it from the totality of the maritime domain that renders our nation whole.
Well, President Marcos taking on a narrative, essentially rejecting the narrative that one has to choose between the major superpowers of today, U.S. and China. He mentioned that there is no choice. Both are needed to maintain stability, both within this region and globally as well. The need to reject major country dynamics, repeating the adage of not needing to have to choose between the U.S. and China. He said it's never a choice. And stressing agency for smaller powers such as the Philippines, the need to reach out, as the Philippines has done with trilaterals with not just the United States, but Australia, Vietnam, and reflecting the commitment, the decision to essentially partner with anyone that shares this commitment to the rules-based international order. And he said to step back from the paralysis of politics. The Philippines is determined to be a force for good, peace, and a staunch based defender of the rules-based international order. Interestingly, questions in the question and answer session, one gentleman asked, what would he consider the crossing of a red line should a Philippine citizen be killed in the South China Sea? And he said it would be a crossing of the Rubicon, and it would require it would be close to an act of war, and the Philippines and its treaty partner, the United States, would respond accordingly. The two countries, of course, have a mutual defense treaty signed in 1951. And we're back with CNA's Leong. He's live from the Shangri-La Hotel in Singapore. Wycott, we heard there a speech with repeated reference to the need to adhere to a rules-based international order, and a reference, of course, to the West Philippine Sea or the South China Sea.
That's right, Wei Su. President Marcos' speech had started very early on, referring to the South China Sea, circling back to the maritime disputes. Of course, he also talked about ASEAN centrality. But I have with me an expert, Jonathan Miller from the Japan Institute of International Affairs, who will unpack the speech and the question and answer session to give us better context. Thank you for joining us, Jonathan. Now, first of all, how would you describe the tone taken in President Marcos' speech earlier on?
Well, I think he wanted to start the tone from the beginning with a couple things. So he started off obviously talking about the South China Sea. He ended off the speech also talking about the South China Sea. But I think it was the tone of that discussion very much being focused on legal, and number one, and also looking more broadly as this a rule of law issue. So I think he wanted to set that tone for the rest of the dialogue, and that followed through the other points of his speech.
Let's talk about the Chinese response. Were you surprised that the Chinese picked ASEAN centrality rather than maritime disputes to ask President Marcos?
I wasn't very surprised with that, to be honest, for a couple of reasons. I think that the Chinese intentionally used this issue of ASEAN centrality, understanding the form that they're in and understanding their tried and tested approach to sort of wedge and divide in between ASEAN members. So there's obviously some members in ASEAN that are closer towards the Chinese side that don't want to take a position. And I think China was playing on this idea that saying, look, you're the president of the Philippines here making this big speech, talking about the rule of law, talking about ASEAN, but yet this is a position that is very much only supported by a couple of members of ASEAN. That's, I think, was the Chinese approach, and they've tried this many times before in many different forums.
Let's stay on ASEAN centrality. Now, we can't run away from the fact that the Philippines has been very vocal against China. The Philippines obviously has played up its allies. ASEAN does not want to choose sides, but given Philippines' position, does it put ASEAN in a very awkward position when it comes to making collective decisions as a bloc as well as negotiating for the code of conduct on the South China Sea?
Of course, it does put ASEAN in a difficult position, but I think at some point, when issues become so critical to the security of one of the members of the unit, I think you have to start soul-searching yourself. And I think this is the importance of his speech, was saying, look, ASEAN talks about common security, they talk about consensus, but if we can't come to a consensus on something so important, and the code of conduct in the South China Sea, the discussions have been going on for decades without any positive traction. So I think his speech was really aiming at this, saying, look, almost testing ASEAN itself with some of the discussions that he put forward.
Right. Would you say that after this speech, after the exchanges, that this might wedge ASEAN further apart from each other, or is it status quo?
I think that there's been a lot of different challenges with ASEAN throughout the year, so I don't think this in particular will be an example where ASEAN drifts. I think that will be the intention. I think the Chinese would be very happy if they could continue to wedge in between there, but I don't think this is going to change the dial very fundamentally.
Right. Let's not forget that in the ballroom there were also countries who are allies to the Philippines. What particular message that President Marcos made to his allies that stood out for you?
Well, a couple of things. I mean, it didn't surprise me that Marcos, again, doubled down on the U.S. alliance. He talked about how important the U.S. relationship was. But I think what was important is that he really referenced, I think, 3 or 4 different times about the complementary allies. So Japan, Australia, he even mentioned India and South Korea. So what he was trying to do there is say, look, this is not just about us saying it's the U.S. or China. We have others in the region that we're working with, that we want to do more with, and that care about the shared equities of security in the South China Sea and more broadly in the region. So I thought that was a really interesting takeaway.
Right. Your point on the complementary allies plays into China's narrative that there are cliques going against China. How do you think that would trigger China further?
Well, I think, of course, China thinks about a lot of these minilaterals. The Quad, of course, with India, Australia, and Japan, and the United States is one of them. But they look at this as other forms of encircling China. But I think the more different members that you see in this, I mean, this is not just the Quad members now. We have South Korea involved in many of these different trilaterals. We have the Philippines now involved. Even Vietnam shares some concerns and worries about China in the region, in particular on the South China Sea. So I think the more partners that the president mentioned, I think really gives a little bit more credence to his point.
Let's circle back to the Philippines and China's relations. After this speech, after the exchange, where do you think their relations stand now?
So it's a rocky relationship right now. I see it continuing to get rocky and a little bit rockier, but I don't think this is going to be a fundamental game changer. I don't think that you're going to see within the next couple of days or within the next week a significant provocation from China. I think we are seeing provocations almost from a weekly perspective already, not taking into account speeches like this. So I don't think it's going to fundamentally change the calculus in Beijing. I think they're going to continue with their behavior that they've exhibited over the past few months.
But you mentioned things will get rocky and rockier. What kind of actions do you predict on the maritime front and the diplomatic front on both countries?
Well, I think in particular on the diplomatic side, I think things are going to, I wouldn't be surprised if we see demarches on from the Chinese side. I think that they're not going to be happy with this speech. They're going to make that known, of course, to Filipino authorities in Beijing. On the maritime side, I think we're going to see the hybrid tactics that we've seen, whether it's through the maritime militia, through the use of the Coast Guard, through fishing vessels. I think we'll probably see a little bit of a ramp up in the next couple of weeks, but I don't think it'll be a fundamental strategy shift from the Chinese side.
Right. Speaking of Coast Guards, what do you make of the timing of this announcement where the Chinese Coast Guards will have special rules in mid-June to arrest suspected trespassers so close to the Shangri-La Dialogue?
I think it's very interesting. I think it's not a coincidence. I think obviously they wanted to time this. They knew that the president was making this speech. I think they wanted to set the stage and set the scenario out ahead of time. And it's also important to think about this not just in a fishbowl and look at the U.S.-China relationship as well. We just had a significant meeting today between the two defense ministers. I wasn't overly surprised or overwhelmed by the takeaways on this, but I think China was trying to set the stage not just with a relationship with the Philippines, but also, of course, with the United States.
The Philippines has said it's going to back its fishermen. China has brushed off concerns that the rules are worrisome. How do you think the dynamics going forward will be, especially when the fishermen, where my Philippines colleague says that the fishermen there, that's their livelihood. And if they continue to go there, how would that play out?
Well, I mean, this is a domestic economy issue for the Philippines, obviously, and I think this is one that the president has played into quite a bit. The issue that I think I worry about is on capabilities. So the intent is there, and I think we saw that from the president's speech. But the capabilities, of course, of the Philippines to be able to deter and to repel some of this Chinese maritime coercion, I think is very difficult. And it goes back to the partners and the allies, and the United States, of course, in particular, trying to lend some of that deterrence. Because capability-wise, right now, they're not able to meet the Chinese challenge.
Right. Let's go back to the Philippines' foreign policy. Based on the speech, do you feel that the Philippines is able to project itself as a valuable middle power amidst today's geopolitical situation?
I think, one thing that was very interesting, and he was very careful about talking about the Taiwan Strait, but I think clearly he wanted to avoid just focusing on the Philippine-China relationship. So he talked about regional security with North Korea, he talked about the Taiwan Strait, he talked about other regional security issues. So I think this is actually the Philippines coming out of its shell a little bit. Of course, they wanted to focus on national security and what matters for their own territorial integrity, number one. But the fact that there was a lot more discussion about the region and global security and how this interconnects with the ASEAN region, I thought was really important. That was a different sort of speech than we're used to hearing from the Philippines.
Now, what for you was you felt missing from the speech? I didn't hear anything about Myanmar, which is in our region. He didn't mention anything about the Israel-Gaza. What do you make of things that were left out in his speech?
Well, I think you hit the nail on the head, especially on Myanmar. And I think more generally, look, ASEAN has a lot of challenges. The South China Sea is a big one, of course, for the Philippines and for other partners, including Vietnam. But there are more things outside of just the South China Sea. There's also economic challenges. There's political governance challenges. There's corruption, etc. So I think there are a number of things that either he wasn't interested in mentioning or didn't get to that I think are going to leave some questions.
Right, let's move a little bit away from the speech today and recap what we saw today. We had this highly anticipated meeting between the defense chiefs of U.S. And China. What do you make of the outcomes of the, or rather the publicly known outcomes of this meeting?
So from what I heard, I mean, the bar, first of all, the threshold of success, I think, was quite low. So I think the fact that the two even met was probably a positive outcome. I mean, we all got used to seeing the picture that one of the pictures that came out where everyone looked like they were eating lemons, and no one wanted to smile. That's not surprising. I think there's a modicum that both sides have to sort of keep up. But I think the outcome, I mean, was that they started talking about crisis communication. This, of course, was a promise from the leader level between Xi Jinping and Joe Biden. Even if this becomes a reality, a hotline is only as valuable as both sides use it. So this is my worry. It's positive that we, in theory, have a hotline in crisis communications. But if the Chinese don't want to use it, if they don't want to pick up the line, it doesn't hold much value.
Well, there have been news agencies, including my own sources, telling me that Ukraine President Zelensky will be coming to the Shangri-La Dialogue. What do you think he will be looking out for?
I think he's coming at a very fragile time right now for his country, obviously. And again, to your point earlier about all the different challenges we're facing, of course, here in the South China Sea and some of the tensions in the Taiwan Straits. We have the war in the Middle East with Gaza. But President Zelensky, of course, wants the global community and the security and defense community not to forget about what's happening in his country. We have the NATO summit coming up in Washington in July. And of course, the beat of momentum is there to try to support Ukraine as much as possible. And the sort of backdrop here is that the cupboards are bare in Europe. So the Europeans do not have the supplies and munitions to help the Ukrainians push back the Russians, who have been cranking out munitions at a very high level. So this all comes back to the United States support and also looking at towards Asian partners. I think my last point on this is we can't forget that a lot of the support has come from some key Asian economies such as Japan and South Korea. South Korea has been backfilling some of the allies in Central and Eastern Europe. So I think there's a lot of different dimensions that I think he'll try to bring out in his remarks.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Jonathan. Jonathan Miller from the Japan Institute of International Affairs.
Oh, thanks. CNA's Leong and Jonathan Miller from the Macdonald-Laurier Institute, looking not just at the Philippine president's keynote address, but also the headline issues and the news lines coming out from today, including that meeting between the U.S. and Chinese defense chiefs.